What if Kelis got into new metal? Find out on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name is Morgan Brown, and for the past few months now I've been making a series of videos that I call What If videos. The idea of these is that each week I take a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which a decision that someone's made or a different set of circumstances caused that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand in order to bring this alternative version of the song to life. So the song I chose this week was Caught Out There by Kelis, and I decided to try and turn that into a new metal song. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
What is this I see? I don't believe you. Don't come home to me. Well, you don't come home to me. I can't deal, can't bear. I want you keep telling me lies, but to your surprise, I hope you're happy since you're caught out there. Yeah, you've been caught. Yo, come on. Yo.
I think Kelis is a really interesting artist and one who's never really got her due, certainly not in her home country, the US. And she's definitely had more success here in the UK than back home in the States. But she's had something like a 25-year career now, because I guess that first album, Kaleidoscope, came out in 1999, and pretty consistently interesting, I'd say. Like most people, the first thing I ever heard by her was her featured vocal on Got Your Money by the great Old Dirty Bastard, but then the next thing would certainly have been Caught Out There, which is a really unusual sounding record. I mean, even now it's a pretty unusual sounding R&B record, and certainly in terms of R&B in 1999, there wasn't anything else that sounded like that. I mean, quite a lot of that obviously has got to be down to the Neptunes who produced it and wrote the track, but even by the standards of the stuff that they were doing, I mean, they were responsible for a lot of hit records at that time, but kind of get the feeling that quite a lot of their more left field stuff got sort of sent in Kelis's direction because she was someone who could really kind of carry that off. I think just that blend of brooding of R&B that just explodes into this shouty chorus is really fascinating and just unlike anything else that was happening in the charts at the time. It was a pretty huge hit over here in the UK, but I gather it wasn't massive in the States, and certainly the album that it came from, Kaleidoscope, pretty much sank without a trace over there, I think. But it's a fairly fascinating record. It's got all kinds of stuff going on, from quite far out futuristic electronica to some fairly deep-rooted jazz influences as well, so kind of covers a wide spectrum of music, and it's a real shame that it didn't catch on. I think the follow-up suffered a pretty similar fate, if anything, maybe even worse. I don't think they even did that much over here. But she's just kept going, kind of ploughing her own furrow, and just every now and then something will catch on commercially. Like obviously Milkshake was the big breakout single, and that's an unusual record as well when you think about it. There's not many people who could carry off something like that. There's almost no melodic content to that backing at all. It's just this hypnotic beat and bloops and pings, and then this incredible vocal that just sells the song. And also Trick Me from that same album, Tasty is the name of the album. Trick Me was a big hit over here, and that's a great record. Really infectious groove to it, kind of like almost a 60s ska sound to the backing of it. But I gather that didn't get released in the States at all, which is just crazy. So yeah, really underrated, I think, in the general scheme of things. A lot of the stuff that acclaimed R&B artists, your Beyoncés and whoever else, have done in the years since. Some of that stuff Kelis was just knocking out on those early albums and not getting credit for at all. Kind of flew under the radar a little bit. Fascinating individual as well. I love the fact that as well as having this really intriguing career in R&B, she's also got a sideline as a chef. She had a range of her own sauces and written cookbooks. I also really fondly remember her from the short-lived BBC show Pitch Battle. I don't know if you remember that at all. It was a weird attempt to simultaneously cash in on the success of Pitch Perfect and Gareth Malone, who was the co-host's popular show The Choir. So it's like an X Factor-ish talent show, but for choirs and a cappella groups. Obviously a doomed format, but strangely compelling, and Kelis made for a really kind of interesting, quirky co-host and a really good foil to this quite upper-class Englishman. So I don't know if that's kicking around on the internet somewhere, but if it is, give it a watch. I found it really entertaining. But yeah, going back to Chords Out There, that debut solo single, she appeared as a feature on a couple of other records, as I say, notably ODB. But Chord Out There, one thing that I always thought about it was just with that mid-tempo kind of solid groove and then this screaming chorus, it always sounded to me like it ought to have some kind of heavy guitars going on there too. That's really what inspired me to do this week's video. So my alternative universe scenario, it's early 1999, Kelis is in the studio with the Neptunes making this record. There's a technical glitch, so recording's halted temporarily while that gets fixed. So Kelis goes off and sits off in the lounge area of the studio, flicks on the TV, puts MTV on, and comes across this video for Freak on a Leash by Korn. So she hears this song, is completely captivated by this sound that she's not heard before. We've got these heavy pummeling choruses, but then these brooding atmospheric verses with this almost kind of dubby bass, and it's just really quite a different sound to anything she's heard before. So while they're frantically working to get the studio up and running, she runs out to the nearest record store and comes back with a big pile of CDs that the staff have recommended for someone who likes Korn. So she's got System of a Down and Slipknot and just a pile of the other kind of contemporary stuff that's coming up in the alternative metal scene at the time. So she's devouring all these, and by the time they're ready to start recording, and she's got a whole new concept of how this record's going to go. So they rework it to be this pounding new metal anthem, and as a result she debuts in a completely different commercial setting and becomes kind of the darling of the burgeoning new metal scene, which to be honest would have probably been a really good thing for the new metal scene. There were obviously several notable people of colour and several notable women in that scene, but I think most people still remember that wave of music as being predominantly angry middle class white boys. So I think if there had been a really prominent woman of colour at the forefront of that movement, that could have been a great thing. But yeah, it was an interesting time, new metal. I sort of didn't get that much involved in it at the time. I was very much the right age to be a new metal fan, being a teenager when those bands were all kind of first coming out. But I think having been a kid who was really into metal coming out of the 80s and into the start of the 90s, I kind of felt like we don't need new metal, old metal's good enough. And by the time it was coming out, I'd pretty much veered off course into punk rock and hardcore, so I wasn't paying as much attention to what was happening in the metal scene at the time. But I think the 90s was a really difficult time for the metal scene. Obviously metal hit a real commercial high point in the 80s in all its different subgenres, from the pop metal stuff of Bon Jovi and Def Leppard through more traditional metal like Iron Maiden, and then the more intense stuff, Megadeth and Metallica being absolutely massive, but Nirvana, the grunge wave, and then the whole rebranding of that as alternative rock that came after that pretty much wiped out a lot of metal, and the bands that did survive were commercially out of favour. It was just considered not to be cool to be into metal by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I don't know if metal was ever cool, but there was sort of a point at the turn of the decade where it was pretty mainstream. A lot of metal bands were having big chart hits. They were filling arenas. It was a big deal, and then there was just a big fall off while so many of the people who were into loud guitar music just transferred their affections over to these alternative rock bands. So I guess there were still people keeping the metal flame alive. I'm thinking like Sepultura, Pantera, Machine Head, bands like that who'd kind of come out of the thrash metal scene and found their own particular style and just kept ploughing on. Their music just developed differently, so it stays really heavy, but they also move into different rhythmic things. So instead of just keeping on trying to go faster and faster, they slow the tempos down occasionally and just get these really pummeling kind of mid-tempo things, which I guess is where the term groove metal comes from, which some people apply to this stuff. Never liked the term, so I'm not going to use it again. But so I suppose that was kind of the main thing that was going on in actual metal at the time while this alternative rock revolution's happening. But generally, metal at this stage, early to mid 90s, has become pretty much an underground phenomenon again. It's not really troubling the mainstream apart from these few sort of leaders of the pack who at least are notching up really good album sales. You start to get bands who are taking what the likes of your Sepulturas and Panteras are doing and combining it with elements of other kinds of music that are compatible with metal but not necessarily from within metal. So some of the things that influence this new wave of bands that are coming through, I guess Faith No More is a big one. Faith No More felt like quite an anomaly in the metal scene of the late 80s, early 90s. Definitely always pretty heavy, but they had these strong elements of funk, quite often really melodic even while they were heavy. They'd have keyboards, which was really unusual in the heavier end of metal at the time. Certainly once Mike Patton joined, he brought a whole different feel to them because he could do the proper guttural metal growl, but his clean vocals had almost an R&B feel to them, which is a whole different flavour for the metal at the time. So they're a real key influence on like this next wave of metal bands who are coming through. I'd say Rage Against the Machine, who had a massive breakthrough in the early 90s, the melding of really heavy riffing with elements of hardcore and then a hefty dose of hip hop as well. So that becomes another key influence. The harder, heavier, more metallic edge of hardcore in the late 80s, I think, was definitely another key influence, particularly thinking of the Bad Brains, who obviously started out in Washington, D.C. in the late 70s and were pioneers of hardcore punk, but then by the later 80s had moved to New York and were quite often making music that was a lot more mid-tempo, a lot heavier. Albums like Eye Against Eye, but particularly Quickness, I think, is a real key influence on a lot of this new wave of metal that's coming out in the 90s. Punishing kind of mid-tempo breakdowns that you hear on Quickness. If you think of like a band like the Deftones, you can see a direct kind of correlation back to that. And then just bands who are on the edge of metal, but also on the edge of alternative rock as well. So I guess the Chili Peppers around Blood Sugar Sex Magic, Soundgarden, all those influences are also feeding into this new wave of metal as well. By the time you get to the mid-90s, there are bands who are coming up who would consider themselves to be to some extent metal bands, but it's not metal as we know it. The previous decade's metal bands, you can generally trace it back somehow, even if through a few filters. You can trace stuff back, for the poppier stuff, you can probably trace it back to Van Halen. For the heavier stuff, you can trace it back all the way to Deep Purple or Black Sabbath through Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. You can't really necessarily see a clear route back to those roots anymore in this new generation of metal bands. So Korn come through, System of a Down, and you can call it metal. It's definitely crushingly heavy a lot of the time, but it's also clearly got a lot of other stuff going on. And then as you get towards the end of the 90s and into the 2000s, the bands are getting more and more polished. There are more and more melodic elements coming in with Papa Roach and then Linkin Park, right down to the really poppy side of it. So Alien Ant Farm, that kind of thing. And you start seeing these bands really doing well on the pop charts. But it was a really influential wave of music. I mean, just think of the ubiquity of the likes of like Limp Bizkit. That stuff was just everywhere. I'm a big fan of pro wrestling, and nu metal just became the soundtrack of that, and to some extent still is. I mean, whatever's gone on in music since, it's still that sort of mid to late 90s metal sound that people associate with that. As I say, it's never really been particularly my cup of tea. I missed it when I was the right age to get into it, and it's not the kind of music that you can really get into as an adult. It's the sound of teenage frustration, basically, and it's perfect for that. I can totally see it. So I never got into it, but just in terms of the time frame that Kelis was making Chord Out There, and just in terms of the tempo of the song and that raging chorus and then the relatively subdued verses, it just seemed like the perfect fit. There was no other genre that I could turn it into. So started out as ever by just syncing up the vocal to the grid in GarageBand. Sped it up a bit. I didn't want to make it too fast because I still wanted it to feel like it had some weight. I didn't want it to be rushing, but sped it up a little from the original. Programmed some drums on there. Didn't want to overdo the sort of more traditional thrash metal kind of things. So there's some double kick bits on there, but it's not all the way through. And I tried to get some little funky snare flourishes and stuff too. In terms of bass, I've actually got 3 different tracks covering the bass frequencies because I wanted to get that contrast like you get on, for instance, Freak Unleashed by Korn, where the verses have this very bassy, almost dubby sounding low end with very little treble. And then as you get into the chorus, there's that much more clanky slap bass going on. Not much of a slap bass player either, I must say, but hopefully at least gives it a bit of that kind of feel. And then just to underpin it all as well, I added a synth bass that just kind of plays a low brooding drone through most of it, apart from the third verse where I dropped it out just to give a bit more of a dynamic contrast before the last chorus. Guitar-wise, I know one of the things that you get with a lot of new metal bands is that genre coincided with the rise of the 7-string guitar, so loads of those players have that sort of extra low 7th string. I don't have a 7-string guitar, so I thought, well, I should try and just tune down to get that really low kind of sludgy kind of chug. Couldn't quite face restringing a guitar with heavier gauge strings just to record one song. So I thought I'll just try and chance it with the strings I've got on there. So I get my low chug, but it does push a bit sharp, and I didn't realize that I'd push things a bit out of tune just with the strings being a bit loose until I started putting other instruments on, by which point I couldn't quite be bothered to go back and redo it. So some of those guitars are a bit shaky tuning wise, so I do apologize for that. But yeah, so I've got a pair of heavy guitars mixed left and right that are tuned down to, I think I tuned them down to C, just doing the kind of heavy down-tuned riffing thing. And then I've got another one playing a higher chorusy melodic thing, which intertwines with a fairly heavily affected piano that also plays a little kind of haunting melody in the verses. And then because there's often the hip hop element in some of this new metal stuff, and you start to see bands that are a conventional guitar band but with a DJ, I thought, I'm going to throw a bit of DJ scratching in there too. So I've got a downloaded sample of some random DJ scratching. So I just popped that on there in some strategic places. And then on GarageBand, there's a function called Flex Time where it allows you to see the transients of the waveform. So each individual sound of that DJ scratch you can see, and you can move them about so you can manipulate the waveform. So I did that, just popped it on there and just kind of manipulated it approximately into time. Apart from that, I just added a bit of distortion to the vocals on the chorus because I didn't want it to be all the way through, but I thought just to make those choruses sound extra angry, we've got a fuzz pedal that just kicks on every time Kelis starts shouting, and that just gives it a bit of extra rage. And then that was about it. So hopefully it sounds a bit like an actual new metal track. And then video-wise, I found a great clip of Kelis on A Lady with Jules Holland, interspersed that with some live footage of Coal Chamber from some festival or other, just so it looks like she's got some authentic new metal musicians rocking along there with her. And also found some great footage of furious mosh pits to mix in there as well. So every time the chorus kicks in, there's some kind of mad wall of death going on. So hopefully that conveys a bit of the feel of the song that I was going for as well. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments. Also, if there's anything else that you'd like me to try, any songs, any genres, any artists you'd like me to take a look at, do just pop a comment down there. I'm always happy to hear your feedback and your suggestions. Got some themed December content coming up, so some wintry stuff, some festive stuff as well. So watch out for that in the coming month. Also, might as well just get in a quick plug. My band, Pardon Us, released a new single recently, and we've got an album coming out next year on the 24th of January, so watch out for that. I'm going to pop a little link up there somewhere for the video, so if you want to have a watch of that, please do. But yeah, that's me for this week, so I'll see you next time.